The early 2010s was not a great time to be a survival horror fan. Capcom's Resident Evil series had fully leaned into its newfound identity as bombastic, over-the-top action games with horror elements. Konami's Silent Hill underwent a 3x combo of disappointment, with a lackluster main series game, an atrocious HD collection, and a handheld action RPG that just couldn't be any further from what a Silent Hill fan wanted. You've got series like Dead Space drifting away from its survival horror origins. There's the rise of the hide-and-seek horror game in which the player is defenseless, overshadowing those classic survival horror elements. And then there's PT, the sky-high raising of hopes, followed by an equal and opposite dashing of them. Yeah, by 2014, things weren't looking good for the survival horror fan, and that's probably why there was such a fervor surrounding The Evil Within. Directed by genre legend Shinji Mikami, The Evil Within promised a return to survival horror. Resource management, self-defense options for the player, terrifying enemy designs, and a story that would range from the psychological to the grindhouse, The Evil Within promised a lot. When it dropped in 2014, it largely delivered on its promises. Though it was far from perfect, the game developed a fiercely loyal fan base who looked past its shortcomings and found something compelling. The game sold surprisingly well enough to warrant the development of a sequel, The Evil Within 2. Mikami would remain involved in a less active capacity, and it's almost immediately evident that this is the case. The sequel takes a far more grounded approach to storytelling and alters the original's gameplay in some really fundamental ways. This might be why there's such a differential between fans of the original game and fans of the sequel. Not to say there's no crossover, but it's a unique series in that the player loyalty seems to be anchored to one game or the other rather than the series itself. Ask a fan of either game what they like about it, and they'll tell you what sucks about the other one. For my money, both games are flawed. Great experiences, but flawed. Yet perhaps due to massively disappointing sales numbers, I find The Evil Within 2 is talked about only a fraction as often as the original. But there's something worthwhile here, unique qualities that the second game has that I'd like to talk about. Namely, its take on open world environments, already something of an anomaly in the horror genre. So what does The Evil Within 2 get right about its environmental design, and where does it fall flat? Well, let's take a look at the first game so we can see the series' roots. If I had to compare The Evil Within to any one game, it'd be Resident Evil 4. Like Resident Evil 4, The Evil Within begins in an eerie village section, somewhat open to player exploration, and gradually hones in on a more action-oriented style of gameplay. The Evil Within focuses more on the horror, allowing players to sneak past various threats as well as burn bodies to prevent them from returning, a la Resident Evil Remake's Crimson Heads. Both games share a strong focus on variety, moving from set piece to set piece in explosive ways and occasionally slowing down the pace to a more traditionally survival horror speed. It's interesting that The Evil Within 2 has so little in common with its predecessor, and that's all thanks to STEM. For those unaware of The Evil Within story, STEM is an interconnected system in which participants are connected to a core. That is, a person whose brain is used to create a world within STEM. People can live in this fully realized world, born from the consciousness of a core subject. What makes The Evil Within story compelling is that you have to piece together this and more information as you play the game, but when you first start out, you have no idea what's going on. What begins for protagonist Sebastian Castellanos as a police investigation quickly becomes a nightmare hellscape, where the player traverses nonsensical environments, deals with otherworldly threats, and pieces together the reality of STEM. This confusion and slow build up to the answers keeps the story intriguing, especially on a first playthrough. Naturally, when thinking about a sequel to such a story, one can't help but wonder, where do we go from here? Both Sebastian and the player are now aware of STEM. The wool can't be pulled over the player's eyes twice. Where The Evil Within uses Sebastian as a vehicle to explore the nature of STEM and its mentally disturbed core, The Evil Within 2 chooses to pursue a much more personal story, digging into Sebastian's background, his family, the depression, trauma, and spiral into alcoholism that occurred after the events of the original game. It's immediately clear from this premise that The Evil Within 2 is a much slower, less aggressively horrifying experience. Even the cover art, which depicts Sebastian in a sort of meditative state, suggests as much as well. Sebastian is once again dropped into STEM, this time to save his family, and after a lengthy prologue chapter, we find what most strongly differentiates The Evil Within 2 from its predecessor. That is the small open world environments in which much of the game takes place. Bear in mind from this point on, when I refer to the game's open world, what I mean specifically is its small open world. I don't mean a giant map totally open to traversal, but smaller, handcrafted environments that allow for limited exploration. This is the town of Union, a once peaceful place turned nightmare in STEM, and there's ample opportunity to tour it throughout the game. There are still chapters that take place in more linear environments, but in these open world sections, much of what made the first game click with people is turned on its head. Like Silent Hill, all roads outside Union have either collapsed or been cut off, leading to a feeling of isolation on this urban island. Thanks to the nature of STEM, the backgrounds of Union become a surrealist landscape with broken pieces of town floating out of reach. When The Evil Within 2 drops you off in these open areas, you're given several districts including explorable buildings, neighborhoods, alleyways, and sometimes rooftops to explore, much of which can be visited at any point in time. Now, how does this affect the game? When you have very small, contained environments or linear corridors, it's much easier to orchestrate the constant resource tug-of-war that characterizes a survival horror game, the best examples of which never allow the player to feel comfortable. There'll be times where you'll have a fair amount of ammo or healing items, and times where you're barely scraping by. But in any case, you should always be keenly aware that you're one botched encounter away from living in ammo poverty again. Yet, in an open world environment, resources are, at least theoretically, scattered everywhere. If you run out of ammo, just go search a dumpster somewhere and you'll inexplicably find some, right? Well, yes and no. In order to expand gameplay variety, incentivize exploration, and balance the potential for resource prosperity, The Evil Within 2 introduces a crafting system. Now, some people are already rolling their eyes at this. Oh, how original, a crafting system in a horror game. And while I don't doubt that this game was inspired by other similar titles such as The Last of Us, the crafting system here is a necessary component in making this game work. Note that crafting can be performed anywhere with a caveat. Making items at crafting benches has a flat resource cost, while performing field crafting ups the cost to a considerable degree. You can stumble across a crafting bench in the field, but they're most reliably found in the game's various safe houses, differentiated from other buildings with a blinking antenna. On top of housing crafting benches, allowing free health regeneration in the form of coffee and being impermeable to enemies, safe houses contain save points. While the sequel's checkpoint system is certainly more generous and less frustrating than that of the original, you'll want to periodically lock in those goodies and crafting materials with a hard save, lest you die out in the field and lose that progress. As for those crafting materials and goodies, what do they include? Well, there's a lot of variety in items here. First of all, you've got guns. The rarest of all, you'll stumble across various different weapons throughout the game. Handguns, shotguns, a sniper rifle, and of course the Warden crossbow. The Warden is an all-purpose weapon, for which bolts with varying effects can be created. All of these weapons can be upgraded using weapon parts, while certain powerful upgrades are gated with the use of rare, high-grade weapon parts. Crafting materials, namely gunpowder, can be used to create ammunition, but there's also things like fuses or pipes to craft bolts, as well as herbs to make healing items. You've got ammo pouch upgrades to increase capacity, the hand axe, a weapon that can only be used once but is almost always a guaranteed kill when swung. There are keys hidden in statues that can be used to open lockers back at Sebastian's safe house. More of a wild card item, they can give you something extremely useful or something you've already got an ample supply of. Then there's green gel. Obtained mainly from killing enemies, it can be used to upgrade Sebastian's skills, some of which are gated with the rare red gel. And I mean, some of these skills make a huge difference. My point in saying all this is that there's a large variety of items that all affect each other in various ways. Guns require ammo. Ammo requires gunpowder to make. Finding gunpowder requires you to put yourself in combat situations. Dealing effectively with those situations requires character or weapon upgrades. Character or weapon upgrades require other resources. I think you get the picture. For our purposes, I think items can largely be broken down into two categories: survival supplies and survivability supplies. Survival supplies include things like ammunition, health items, the hand axe, basically items and tools that allow you to participate in the moment-to-moment gameplay without getting slaughtered. Survivability supplies are things like green gel, weapon parts, pouch upgrades, things that give survival supplies more bang for their buck. They're technically luxuries. They're not necessary for survival, you have to hunt them down in the game's open sections to find find them, and they usually require some kind of investment or trade-off. But they pay dividends, making you faster, more deadly, sneakier, basically allowing you to wander the environments with confidence, at least for a while. More on that later. Due to the nature of an open world environment, the developers can never really be sure how you'll take on challenges. There has to be resources to match any playstyle. You have to know as a player that there's always a way forward, even if it feels extremely difficult to progress. For there to literally be no way to progress short of reloading an old save is just bad design. So on one end of the spectrum is the trigger-happy player. They panic and fire their shotgun at enemies. They miss. They fire again. They miss. They fire again. Okay, this time they get it. Only those 3 shotgun shells you celebrated picking up 10 minutes ago are now gone, and there's still 1,000 enemies between you and your destination. The Evil Within 2's solution to this problem is a vastly expanded stealth system from the original. Now you can take cover behind objects, bottles can be used to both distract enemies and break out of their grasp. Stealth attacks are a guaranteed kill on most standard enemies. Investing green gel into the stealth skill tree is critical in higher difficulties, as one upgrade called Predator allows you to sprint up to enemies in silence and take them out quickly. Perhaps a little overpowered on lower difficulties, but a lifesaver on higher ones, especially Akumu, in which Sebastian dies in one hit. Now, it's not always possible to perform a sneak kill. Enemies congregate in groups, they move and turn their heads erratically when alert, making it difficult to execute execution. So in a bad situation, you might need to circumvent large groups of enemies, which is fine in the short term, but by doing so, you're setting yourself up for a suboptimal experience. So it's here we head to the other end of the spectrum, the seasoned survival horror veteran. Cautious, forward-thinking, kind of a skinflint when it comes to expending ammo, they find clever ways to hoard ammo and healing items, avoiding conflict wherever possible and only engaging when absolutely necessary. Well, it's no fun to bang your head against a wall dealing with a difficult challenge. The only thing worse is feeling like there's no challenge to speak of. In order to incentivize these players to get their hands dirty, green gel is waved in front of the player's face. Yeah, you want that Predator unlock? You got a long way to go. Better start saving, which means killing enemies, in particular the tougher enemies who give greater amounts of green gel. The other, perhaps more important reason to engage with enemies is the structure of the open environments. You loop back on previous areas. Side activities and story objectives send you into the same area multiple times. You know you'll be back, so it's prudent to deal with the enemies when you can. There's a kind of natural push and pull as you sneak around town, hoarding resources, and then, following a period of abundance, you confidently let your guard down in order to deal with the threats around town, dwindling your ammo supply and forcing you to play cautiously once again. In theory, this is the balancing factor of The Evil Within 2. It doesn't always necessarily play out like this though, which is why I highly recommend playing the game on Nightmare difficulty at least. I don't recommend that lightly. I wouldn't do the same for the first game unless you really want a challenge, but The Evil Within 2 really shines on the higher difficulty settings. Encounters become more tense, resources have more value, you can't just be fucking Rambo anymore. Well, you can, but it's much harder. Unfortunately, the easy and medium difficulty settings somewhat trivialize the accumulation of certain resources, especially healing items, of which you'll have so much you won't know what to do with them. Thankfully, the game has a few more tricks up its sleeve in order to balance the resource problem. Upon returning to previous areas, new and stronger enemies will spawn, giving the game an upward crescendo of difficulty as you find more tools to deal with these threats. This is especially true in Chapter 13 with these fire guys. They are absolutely brutal, require massive ammo expenditure, but if you can kill 2 of them, you'll gain the parts required to build a flamethrower. Yeah, you don't have to drain your ammo supply, you can sneak around them, but you kinda wanna see what that flamethrower can do, don't you? In addition to these more difficult enemies spawning, about half of The Evil Within 2 takes place in more linear, level type areas, akin to how Resident Evil 4 guides you to similarly paced sections as well. In these areas, enemies and resources can be more deliberately paced, essentially forcing you to use up what you have before returning to the more open environment, a clean slate for the developers to work with as you explore town, regaining what was used on the previous area's boss. Looking at this from a bird's eye view, you might see it as unfair, but it never feels unnatural or needlessly harsh. If anything, you feel relieved that you managed to use up everything you had and made it by the skin of your teeth in the previous chapter. This is especially true during boss battles in the late game, where a barrage of focused challenges gives you no choice but to use every last resource you have. It's a great way to ensure the player doesn't move into the next section with a bandolier of ammo, while also giving them positive feelings for using all they had at their disposal to beat a difficult section. As for overcoming the monumental challenge of balancing a survival horror game in the open setting, The Evil Within 2 does respectably well. Clever design decisions, including the incentivization of resource use, the funneling of players through linear sections, and the necessity of clearing areas in the open world, promote that feeling of vulnerability inherent to horror. But this is mostly true on the higher difficulties, and even then, Nightmare difficulty doesn't always strike the perfect balance. Easy and medium are better suited to players who just want to explore or experience the game's story, and it's here where The Evil Within 2 is notably different from the other games in its genre as well. Rarely do you associate that feeling of finishing the prologue chapter, stepping out into the world, and being able to choose where you head next with a survival horror game, but such is the case here. While the game does have a map, and it can be used to place markers, for the most part you rely on it remarkably little to explore and find points of interest, which is refreshing considering open world games are usually marred by checklists. Rather than having your eyes glued on a minimap, The Evil Within 2 keeps your eyes on the world. And while the level design isn't quite as spontaneous and bizarre as its predecessor, it uses its small town suburban setting to immerse you in something more immediate. I can't speak for everybody here, but I just like small towns as a setting in video games. There's something so appealing about the familiarity and manageable scale of a small town, and while this one isn't exactly as delightful and charming as, say, Stardew Valley, I still enjoy exploring it. The businesses, the post office, the police station, etc. As somebody who grew up in a small town, I remember daydreaming about where I'd go and what I'd do in an apocalypse situation, and The Evil Within 2 kinda plays on that. Mind you, not every building can be entered. The game uses visual points of interest in order to attract your attention to those you can enter. Church steeples, congregations of zombies, street and porch lights, and as mentioned, that blinking antenna on top of safe houses. There's almost always an extrinsic reward waiting for those intrepid enough to follow their intuition. And since Sebastian needs resources to save his daughter, there's never any dissonance between what you as a player are interested in doing and what the story demands of Sebastian. For some more significant points of interest, you've got your communicator. Radio static marks points of interest in the world. Flipping open your communicator when it's heard will allow you to find the exact location of the interference. The things you'll find can be as simple as extra ammo or gunpowder, or as major as significant side quests marked with resonances. This leads to another concern one may have with open world horror. That's the inability for developers to curate terrifying experiences for the player. If you think of a horror game, you might think of certain moments such as the dog breaking through the window in Resident Evil, the cat jumping out of the locker in Silent Hill, or the introduction of Laura in The Evil Within 1. The open world environments could be more associated with anxiety than the bespoke haunted house moments of a traditional horror game, which could be seen as a weakness, especially contrasting the game with its predecessor. Yet The Evil Within 2 does a respectable job of still allowing for those orchestrated spooky moments within its open world structure. For one, consider the fact that roughly half the game is more linear. These moments can and do happen throughout the game, leading to some memorable scripted sequences. But even within the open world chapters, these moments are cleverly tied into the game without the player being sequentially dragged into a different zone and suffering whiplash. There are certain areas which, when explored, trigger scripted moments to occur while still giving you that open world agency and how you'd like to deal with them. There's reoccurring enemies such as the Anima Ghost or the Guardian, whose unexpected presence can lead to some genuinely panic-inducing moments when you're caught off guard. But more cleverly than that, The Evil Within 2 uses resonances to guide your attention and seamlessly drop you into the more linear haunted house type sections. Take for example 345 Cedar Avenue. Entering here and exploring, the structure of the house begins changing, funneling Sebastian towards a more traditional horror section, breaking perspective and forcing the player into a linear situation without ever really making it feel like you're in a different level. The sections with the Anima Ghost are similar to this, temporarily placing you in a defenseless situation in familiar areas simply by interacting with the environment. You could almost characterize these open world sections as hubs from which you can optionally engage with exploration and plot advancement, or side activities in areas separate from the main map. This gives the player the ability to make their own choices as to whether or not they want to break from the standard open world gameplay. Like The Evil Within 2's resource balance, I think this is a clever idea which isn't balanced perfectly. Namely, I don't think they go far enough with it. There are a limited number of these sections you can engage with, but the fact that they're largely optional is impressive. And if you care about the game's story, experiencing all of these is integral in understanding the context of Sebastian's mental state and bringing closure to his personal demons. On the topic of side quests, you'll have the opportunity to talk to members of Mobius, that is, the organization that runs STEM, throughout the game. Trapped in the system, they'll give optional missions to Sebastian in exchange for some pretty great rewards. It's interesting to note Sykes in particular. While wandering Union, you'll hear him screaming for help. If you ignore it and come back later, he can just die. locking you out of a significant side quest that runs through 2 different chapters. Accepting a quest from Sykes or O'Neill gives you a secondary objective that requires you to traverse the Marrow, a backdoor meant for Mobius employees to easily move across Union. In this case, just an excuse to have a cool Umbrella-style laboratory in the middle of a small town. A nice way to introduce more level variety, further enhancing those feelings of exploration and player agency. It wouldn't be unreasonable for Tango Gameworks to have made these anima sections and Mobius side quests mandatory. They maintain the quality of any main mission, but as always, I have to respect that willingness to place responsibility on the player. There are a lot of creative ideas at work for the open world genre, and the fact that they're in a horror game is really unusual. I don't think everything about the Evil Within 2's design works like gangbusters. There are imbalances that can hurt your experience with the game on certain difficulty levels, and some of the ideas that work better, such as this notion of the open world acting as a hub world, are underdeveloped or underutilized. But there are so many moving parts that allow for this game to work when it really shouldn't. It was a step away from the traditional horror of the Evil Within, and while that didn't sit right with all fans, I have to respect the creativity at work here. It's a damn shame that a sequel is so unlikely due to poor sales, because there's a glowing ember of potential here. In this game, they've already begun to combine a focus on open environments with the set-piece based areas of the first game, and leaning further into this combination could result in a game with a truly unique identity, appealing to both the innate excitement of exploring parts unknown with the understated thrills of the survival horror genre, all while carefully guiding the player into a roller coaster of empowering resource abundance and nail-biting scarcity. If you haven't played the Evil Within games, I'd recommend checking out both, at least if you're a horror fan. There's something really interesting going on in the design of each, especially in contrast to one another. It's doing a lot with relatively little and contains lessons I hope to see applied and improved upon in future games of this style, or, in a perfect world, a sequel that blows all of us away, satisfying fans of the first and second game while enticing new players into the weird world of STEM. Well, a man can dream. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe saw things from a different perspective. I knew I wanted to cover at least one horror game for this Spooktoberween, and The Evil Within 2 had been on my mind for a while. I'd like to thank my patrons for their patronage. Using money from my Patreon coffers, I purchased a new microphone. Hopefully the recording quality sounds a little bit better. I plan on continuing to invest in things that'll make the videos better. I'd like to especially thank those in my Person of Lordly Caliber tier on Patreon: Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Avil, and Hime Takamura. That's 2 different patrons, by the way, but you know, as a married couple, it just feels right keeping them together, wouldn't you say? True Manalist, Scatmouth, Spencer Kennelly, Smo Bun. Do I seriously have to read this fucking name? I'm Emile Castagne's #1 fan. Very fucking funny, John. Captain, BB Squirrel, JBK, Francois, Fnar, and Fenrir Lives, who also made my rippin' profile picture. It's truly humbling to receive so much support on Patreon, in the comments, and on social media. If you'd like to support me as well, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you really want to help out, consider taking a look at my Patreon and pledging if you're so inclined. In any case, thanks for watching, and until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.